Welcome to Green and Steel, everybody. Today we're going to be making some beautiful epoxy and wood coasters. Now the very first thing we need to do is we need to make sure we clean up all that bark off of that wood. So I crack out the Dremel for this and I use the little sanding disc. And this takes quite a bit of time, so just be patient when you're doing this. Now the reason that we do this step is so that the wood and the epoxy can bond together properly. Now if you don't take this step and you don't clean up your wood very well, then your coasters just might not have as long of a lifespan as they could have. Once all the wood's all cleaned up, I like to place all the pieces on a sheet of melamine just to kind of visualize what the coasters are going to look like. So the next step would be to figure out how big of a mold you need to make. Now that greatly depends on how big your coasters are actually going to be. So my coasters, for example, are going to be 4x4, which means that my mold has to be a multiple of 4 inches by 4 inches. Then once you've figured out that, then you would want to add about a half an inch or an inch or so that you can cut off the dirty edges once you take the epoxy sheet out of the mold. Now once I've made all the appropriate cuts that I needed to, I start assembling the mold and I just use some cabinet screws for this. Then once it's all assembled, I just grab the silicone and I start sealing up all those corners so that there are no leaks when I finally pour my epoxy. So make sure you really take your time with this and you cover every single crack that you possibly can, because leaks are not fun at all to deal with, so please do yourselves a favor and take your time here. Now once our silicone is finally cured, we're first going to come back with our mold release spray, and then we're going to spread it nice and evenly with a little brush. Now the next step is to make sure that your wood stays in place and it doesn't float on your epoxy pour. So the way I did that is I made a small batch of epoxy and I spread it nice and thin right on the bottom, and then I set my wood pieces inside of the epoxy and let that cure. Now this is actually the part of the project where you really decide what your coasters are going to look like, so take your time when you set this up. Now that the epoxy has finally cured and the wood is stuck in place, I'm going to come back with some sandpaper and I'm going to scuff up that epoxy really well. That way it bonds to the main epoxy pour. So now that everything's all scuffed up, I'm finally ready for my main pour. So for these coasters, I went with a misty white look because I wanted them to almost be transparent, so I made sure not to use too much white pigment. So the first mistake I made here in this project is that I started swirling this black into the epoxy way too soon. I should have waited another 2 or 3 hours. Typically you want to wait about 12 to 13 hours before you start swirling. So what ended up happening was it ended up dissipating and I had to re-swirl a couple hours later. So here we are about 4 or 5 days later. The epoxy has finally cured and it's ready to be taken out of the mold. Now, as I'm taking it out of the mold, I'm already noticing that it's really, really thin, and I'm not sure that I can even plane it down to the proper thickness without it being way too flimsy. But I decided to go ahead and start planing it anyways, and lo and behold, the coasters were way too thin. So I had to scrap this entire batch and restart. So here I am after I finally did everything the right way this time, and the sheet is nice and thick and it can be planed down to a ½ inch the right way. So as you can see here with this batch, I made this mold a little bit narrower and a lot longer. That way I can just run it through the planer instead of using the router sled, which is a huge pain in the butt. Now the planer obviously made very quick work of this sheet, which I was super grateful for. And I also, on the last few passes, I made sure to keep the planer on finishing mode so that it was a little bit smoother and I didn't have to sand quite as much. Now here I am sanding to get all those planer marks off. And this process, again, does take a very, very long time, so just be patient here. Now once I've sanded the planer marks off, I come back with some CA glue and I fill any imperfections that I see, and then I sand it back down so it's smooth again. It's at this stage that I'm finally ready to cut this big sheet into individual coasters. So the very first thing I do is I cut the very edge off of each side. So now that the sheet has clean edges to run up against the fence, I will set my table saw to 4 inches, which is the size of the coasters that I want. And I go ahead and cut the sheet into 4-inch strips. Next, I'll go ahead and turn the strips horizontally, and I make sure to be really careful here because this is kind of sketchy. And I go ahead and I cut them into 4-inch squares. So another tedious but I think essential part of this project is to make sure that your edges look super professional. So the way I did that is I used the disc sander and I cleaned up all those edges one by one. Now after hours of grueling sanding, it's finally time to put the finish on, the moment I've been waiting for, the moment you all have been waiting for. So, once I've cleaned up all the coasters with some isopropyl alcohol, I'll crack out the Odes oil and a white pad, and I just start rubbing it into them one by one. Now keep in mind you really don't need that much Odie's oil, a little bit goes a long way. After about an hour of letting the Odie's oil sit on all those coasters, I come back with a little towel and I wipe off all of the excess. And what they say is that you can never wipe off too much, but you can leave too much on. So make sure you're very thorough when you wipe it off. So this next step isn't really essential if you're just making these for yourself or for friends or family. But if you are packaging these and shipping these to customers, I do think it's really important to make sure your packaging looks presentable. So the way I did this is I just took some twine and I basically just wrapped it around a set just like I would wrap some string around a present for Christmas. And now for the grand reveal, here's what the final product looked like. So they did sell out very quickly, but I did make a much larger batch and I did end up making black coasters with white swirls as well, and they looked very cool, as you can see here. So if you are interested in purchasing a set of white or black coasters, go ahead and hit the link to my Etsy in the description. I hope you guys all learned something or just enjoyed this video in general. And if you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and a comment. I'd really appreciate it. And do subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this.